What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Nioh 3. Latest installment in, of course, the Nioh series, but also a sort of evolution of their own formula, while also bringing it to a semi-open world. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. With that said, a couple of other things to mention. So with Nioh 3 in particular, I did in fact buy this game, no review copy or anything. We are a couple weeks past its initial release date, as I had some other things to do in the meantime, but the other thing that I wanted to mention here is that while this is accurate for the base game, what has happened with the Nioh games of the past is that they have released DLC that has subsequently added on to the game's New Game Plus cycles, adding in various challenges as well as like new gear progression, etc., that turned it into a different game in the end game than you necessarily started out with. And that's important for Nioh because we haven't quite got to that point yet. And so if you're watching this in the future, I may well have reviewed those in their own videos and probably link them down below in the comments. But for the sake of this particular video, that stuff simply does not exist yet, but will eventually. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive into this in full. So Nioh 3 brings a sort of semi-open world via its hub system that we saw an initial version of in their previous title, Rise of the Ronin, alongside like proper little side quests and things away from the mission structure of the original two titles. That, on top of some larger mechanical changes such as style shifting between samurai and ninja, make for an experience that in many ways I would say kind of feels like they took 1 and 2's combat systems, combined them, and then rolled out some new features alongside them as well. And so what we have here is a bit of a mix of those things. While there are several prominent large hub areas that you'll be running around for most of the game, there are in between those things like the crucibles as well as just more linear sections in general that seem to serve as the more typical dungeon-oriented experience you might be used to from this type of game. And yet, I wouldn't say it's all sunshine and rainbows, because in the process of doing all that, I would say they took a gear system that was already a bit of a hassle to manage and only made that worse by giving you actively 2 sets of gear to manage constantly, adjusting the way magic works to make it feel a little bit less accessible, if anything, alongside some other things that I'm hoping to outline over the course of this particular video. So let's go ahead and dive into that, starting first with, as usual, the technical state of this game. So for me at least, and my PC specs are in the About section of the channel by the way, Nioh 3 ran quite well. Really the only thing I have to complain about is that a single time upon loading into an area I just got an endless black screen and had to force quit it and restart the game. That was the only issue I ran into personally. However, a quick browse through some of the user reviews, etc., will point to some problems with performance. I know in the couple weeks since this game launched and when I got around to it, they fixed some problems with quests potentially soft locking on you, that kind of thing. And while I didn't really experience any of that stuff personally, I did just want to point out that some people have had some issues with it. What's more, some various options. So throughout the gameplay, you're going to see me do a few different things that can be addressed via the settings menu if you personally don't like them. Starting with your burst break shifts. So when enemies do a big wind-up attack that flashes red, you can burst counter it, and when you do that, you can also shift from the style you're in into your other non-active style, so, samurai or ninja. It is possible to turn that off in terms of like the shifting and allow you to simply counter the attack without doing so. It's also possible to just like hoover up all of the loot automatically instead of doing it manually like you'll see me doing in all this footage, but that's just a personal preference. I like to pick it up. The keyboard and mouse controls are actually also pretty good for this title, so just some general stuff I wanted to mention here towards the beginning. And next up, let's talk a little bit about difficulty and New Game Plus. So this game, like many a Souls-like title, so to speak, has its own difficulty settings. Now, I would not say that Nioh in general as a franchise fits neatly into the Souls-like category. In fact, Team Ninja, the developer, really seems to be trying to push the concept of Masocore, though it never really seemed like that ever took off. But either way, It's not exactly the easiest game in the world, but I did want to point out that it is currently probably about as easy as it is going to get, because as DLC releases and they release subsequent New Game Plus cycles, that will ramp up in difficulty as you go, meaning that your first run through the game is often sort of training for what's going to come later, especially since you can't even get into, I would say, the more in-game gear progression until you finish the game to begin with, which then unlocks your initial New Game Plus cycle, Shogun's Journey. Now, the main difference is this is when you start dropping the new tier of gear, which will allow you to then, via things like the blacksmith, upgrade and customize that gear, really hone in on set bonuses, and get into the nitty-gritty of fine-tuning your specific build and how you're going to fight against enemies that are only growing more challenging as you go. But the nice thing about New Game Plus is that it does allow you to focus on just the things you want to, because in theory you'll have ran through the game entirely before that on your first run. Though given the slight departure and open world-ish nature of this one, I'll be curious to see exactly how they approach the rest of the New Game Plus cycles, but currently the way it works is basically you can run through the main story again across the various hubs, and the game will even note the things that you've already collected, etc. on a prior difficulty, which can help in tracking some things down, I imagine. Now, before we move on just a little bit, the next thing I wanted to mention here is actually that something that Team Ninja seems to be learning, which I always appreciate, is that they put the tutorial right at the beginning of the game. So, a problem you could sort of run into with the Nioh 1 especially, I would say, when it was brand new, so to speak, and Souls-like in general tend to do this, where you first have to fight your way through an opening situation, which can be usually met with a difficult boss at the time, which is then made more difficult by the fact that the game often doesn't like to tutorialize you with this. This was very prominent in the original Nioh as an example, because after you got out of that initial sequence, then the game gave you a tutorial and broke down how to do things and how to play the game, which felt a little silly. Here they do actually front load the tutorial and get people up to speed. So, long story short, while it is certainly a difficult game, having played the previous two and, just being able to, of course, know the mechanics ahead of time already, and the fact that I got really into the style shift into Ninja and Samurai as well, I had a lot of fun playing through this game on its base difficulty, and New Game Plus didn't feel insurmountable or anything. Just remember that this game is very much so about loot progression and scaling up your abilities and damage accordingly, and sometimes if you can't beat something, it's because it's a bit out of your level range and you shouldn't be there yet. Moving on a bit though, let's next talk character creation. So there is a cosmetic character creation, and this is something Team Ninja does surprisingly well with, just a ton of different options and everything for you to explore and customize your character exactly the way you want them. If anything, I personally think it's one of the more, I would say, exhaustive cosmetic character creators out there, and if that wasn't enough for you, you can actually do it twice. So with you being able to shift between Samurai and Ninja style, you can actually customize a character for each style if you want, and they can either look the same or radically different if you please. Me personally, I just changed their hairstyle as an example. Either way though, pretty impressive character creation if you're really into getting into the nitty-gritty of that, with the rest of progression coming in later, which brings us to the story setup and my thoughts on it. So, Nioh 1 and 2 aren't exactly renowned for their story, and I don't think Nioh 3 will be either, as it is a game primarily about combat and the feel of that, and of course triumphing over adversity as you grind your way to ever and ever greater heights with your character. Nonetheless, I will say that Nioh 3 probably has the most easily comprehensible story of the three games, given that they've clearly learned some lessons along the way about presenting this stuff, though there is a bit of time hopping around which can complicate things a little bit, but again, it's fairly easy to follow otherwise. You play as the intended shogun who is about to take control of things, only to, right as that is about to happen, be betrayed by your brother who seems to have succumbed to some dark influence. And your job, of course, after escaping the immediate threat, is to get to the bottom of this. You come into contact with an artifact, and doing so that allows you to travel to various points in time, following the new Crucianite. So, Nioh has always had a substance called Amrita, or Spirit Stones, which are enabling all the crazy stuff we see, like the yokai, your own powers, that kind of thing. But this new kind, Crucianite, seems to be corrupting things, and wherever it goes, there are these big giant crucibles in the sky that have to be dealt with, and in tracking that stuff down, you get to the mystery of why you were betrayed, what has been causing all this stuff across time, and it's a relatively decent story for what this type of game is. Even if, again, I don't think it's really the thing this game will be remembered for, mind you. But if you're really into Japanese history, etc., it can be like a fun sort of alternative look at a lot of that stuff, and I'm sure that will appeal to enough people all on its own. So there is that. Now, this next part then brings us to this game's progression systems, which is going to take us a little bit because a game like this is, I would say, almost 90% progression systems. With that exact thing in mind, if you have played Nioh 1 and Nioh 2, you will almost certainly get the bulk of how this works without having to do too much extra work to understand it. I'm still going to cover all of it to be thorough, or at least try to cover all of it. If I miss something, it's probably just because I forgot about it, as there is a lot to cover here. But if you want to skip this section just because you've played the previous games and you know more or less what to expect, I don't think you'd be missing much. To that end, let's go ahead and dive into it, starting with the easy part. As we kill things, complete quests, etc., we are going to be picking up Amrita, or our experience basically, and we're going to spend that to level up. Upon level up, you can increase one of your attributes or your stats, many of which scale to the various different weapons that you'll be carrying around, and that weapon scaling continues well on past the point of diminishing returns for the rest of the stat. This means that the first, I would say, 20 or 30 points you put into something are more impactful than the later ones in terms of everything besides the weapon scaling. Then we've got our 2 sets of gear. So whereas in the first 2 games you would just kind of have your main set of gear that you're wearing, this time you actually need to manage 2 sets at a minimum, and this is to differentiate between the samurai and the ninja. And this isn't just like a nice suggestion, you straight up have to, as they cannot use the same things and they cannot even equip the same weapons outside of ranged weaponry. Further differentiating what each of these styles actually does, yes, but it can become a bit of a logistical nightmare in trying to keep up with everything you're doing upgrades-wise. And if that already wasn't enough for you, there only gets to be more, as once you get access to the Eternal Rift, which is like sort of your home hub area where you can relax and focus on gear and upgrades, that kind of thing, you'll unlock the blacksmith, and through her side quests are known as myths generally, but through doing all of that you can then upgrade the blacksmith, who can do more and more for you along the way, which allows you to upgrade and customize this gear, including increasing its level to coincide with your own so that it stays useful as you level up, soul matching and soul forging being the bulk of that. You can also break down items for disassembly, you can craft new items, like if you're after a specific set and you don't want to wait for it to drop and you have increased the rarity tier of what the blacksmith can do for you anyway. It's very possible to just like craft the set pieces of a gear set and then get the bonuses that way. And then there's stuff like reforging, which allows you to customize individual bonuses that an item might have on it. But I would say very broadly, I would not worry about the blacksmith too much until you start getting into New Game Plus, because that's when you are going to make the most of her services. Once you've kind of figured out what the actual gear and stuff you want to wear is, in terms of like set bonuses, etc., and then also kind of have hit the item level cap and can start focusing on the +1, +2, etc. as you go. Plenty more to go, however, because as you are using some of that gear, you're going to pick up plenty of things along the way, starting with your weapon skills. As you progress through the game, you will find samurai and ninja locks. These are effectively skill points that you can spend on skill trees, either for your base samurai and ninja skills or on weapons specifically, and this is going to unlock things for you per style, if you will. So the samurai does not start with the stances from the previous game, but can unlock them. And then you'll have a potentially low and high stance that you can switch between while a samurai, as an example. And then each weapon skill tree is basically a large amount of combos and things that you can set to be associated with each individual attack action. And then, of course, combining all that together to do said combos is a significant portion of progression. And again, given that you have to switch weapons between styles, this becomes a bigger deal as well, and then each individual style can eventually equip 2 weapons at once. So at most, you'll be able to use 4 of these at a given time, but there are quite a few of them, so there's plenty of options, especially on the samurai side of things where you can be like switching your stance and whatever. Now, the ninja side of this works a little bit differently because a lot of what they unlock instead of stances is ninjutsu, allowing them to use little items and stuff during combat that recharge the more you attack and kill things in combat. And combined with their faster traits and everything is where they change up how each of them plays individually. Tons left to go yet still, however. We've also got your, I believe they're called secret skills this time around. Basically, as you're exploring out in the open worlds, you can find these books and stuff that are your secret skills. You can also find books that increase your max capacity for these, but your skills, or secret skills, obtained in this manner, can be equipped to your character in general or your samurai and your ninja forms respectively. This is where you're going to get all sorts of little bonuses based on what you equip. You could almost think of these like perks that you're finding. This is where they have relegated some stuff that was in the previous games in the skill trees too as well. So one thing I always like to do, especially for the samurai here, is to key pulse on dodge. So key pulse is a way to regenerate stamina as a samurai super fast, and there's an option to activate that on dodge instead of its own sort of individual key, which is something I've always liked previously about the last two games. That is now relegated to these secret skills, and then it goes more and more in-depth from there, but it's just another way to allow you to customize exactly what you're doing with an individual character, and these range from everything like what I just mentioned to damage buff, damage reduction, general utility, etc., etc. There's also your reputation. So as you basically just play the game and complete various things, perform certain actions, stuff like that, you'll earn reputation, which can then be spent on titles effectively, which allows you to get little bonuses from doing exactly that, and that's broken down into a bunch of categories that you'll earn naturally as you play. In a similar manner, there's also Kodama and Jizo. These are things you'll find out in the open world. That is to say, you can find Kodama and send them back to the shrine, which is helpful generally, and then you can pray at the Jizo statues you find. Doing both of these things gives you merit for the associated thing that then at your checkpoints can be spent on further little bonuses to upgrade and the like, making you more effective in crucibles, making it easier to find elixirs, just all sorts of different stuff. Then there is your guardian spirits, of course. You'll pick up a bunch of these as you play the game, but guardian spirits are the spirit that is attached to your character. You start out with your basic one, Kusanagi, and then as you defeat various characters throughout the story and understand them, you'll gain even more of these guys, and they serve a few different functions. Most of it is stats and spirit skills attached to your character, which I'll explain more in the combat section, but another aspect of it is actually open world progression, as unlocking some of these guardian spirits allows you extra traversal out in the open world at certain points that cannot be traversed otherwise, known as spirit veins. Then there are soul cores. So as you defeat enemies, they have a chance to drop a soul core. This is where they have moved the magic system to. At your checkpoint with soul cores, you can assign them to the yin or yang position of your Onimo box once you pick it up. This is something that scales directly with your magic ability, that is to say your magic stat quite literally, allowing you to equip more of these. Depending on which position you put it in, yin or yang, you can get stats from your individual soul cores that you equip, or you can get talismans that allow you to cast spells or summon that creature that you got the soul core from, as, again, the sort of game's magic. And this is where all those abilities have been tied to, and you have to find and equip the appropriate soul cores to do all of this. After a certain point in the game, you'll be able to upgrade these soul cores by simply increasing their level, which will increase their stats, or on that same sort of menu area, you can instead increase the level of your guardian spirits as well, both of which are done by destroying old soul cores you're not using and then using that material to upgrade the stuff you've got. And then, believe it or not, there are the open world bonuses that you'll get from clearing individual zones out in the open world. Once you complete individual areas, you will get actual stat bonuses and stuff as a result of all that. And then I think that's just about everything, but the last thing I want to mention is the clan bonuses, which is technically speaking part of co-op. Once you get to a certain point in the game, you can join a clan, so to speak. This is done like in-game. It's not like a guild or anything like that, but rather you pick one of the clans of Japan to attach yourself to, and then other characters who are also in that clan can, simply by playing the game together, accomplishing certain objectives, etc., get collective bonuses and stuff, and then just by joining one of those clans, you can get various bonuses based on the one you join as well, though we'll talk a little bit more about co-op here in a bit. Either way, I would say that is the bulk of the progression systems to know as a baseline, and while yes, it definitely is a lot, I promise you it is a little bit smoother than it can sound during all of that, as you gotta understand that you'll be engaging with each of these systems as they are relevant, rather than necessarily all at once in many cases, especially once you kind of pick the thing you want to do at a given moment, and then you just don't necessarily need to engage with it a ton, especially once you start hitting level cap and everything. But all of these little systems combined and how they interact, etc., is what is going to build your ultimate character at the end of the thing. Which then brings us to one of the more interesting parts of all of this, which is the gameplay and world section. So with these new open world hubs, we have a good bit to talk about, but I would say as a base level, if you played Rise of the Ronin not all that long ago, you would get an idea at a baseline of how this is going to work. Each open world hub is divided up into a bunch of smaller zones. Each of these zones has an exploration level attached to it. The more you do there, be that finding stuff, side quests, etc., that exploration level goes up, revealing more of the zone, making it easier to track down more and more of what you need, provided you are able to get to it in the first place, as some things like spirit veins are tied to story progression, etc. Now, some of the stuff you can actually get up to in those zones are things like side quests or your myths. So what they did here is, rather than the mission structure of the original games, they took that and of course just applied it to the open world more generally. Some of these are pretty interesting. Some of them are a little more just sort of fetch quest type things in nature. Sometimes you're just tracking down an item, and while none of them are like incredible feats of engineering or anything like that, there's enough there to keep you interested and exploring. Running around these zones, you're going to be interacting with both hostile and friendly yokai. Friendly yokai are the various types of collectibles. There are the Scampus hunts, I guess you could call them, where you find a Scampus, a sort of round cat-like blob that then tries to run away from you, and based on the type of Scampus it is, you track them down and they reward you, which you can then take back to a great Scampus at your hub zone. There are the Chijiko, these sort of weasel-like bell guys who float around, and you have to shoot them, which will bring them down to you, and once you pet them, you get a little bonus for doing that as well. You can find your Kodama. Kodama allow you to regenerate more elixirs every time you rest at the shrine, just by default, but also provide those Kodama bonuses I've already mentioned. There are also masters that you will eventually find. These are masters of a given type of weaponry or combat approach. There are 13 of them. Besting them in combat gives you access to some of their skills and the like. There are the spirit veins I already mentioned. As we acquire more and more guardian spirits, we can navigate more and more of those. There are crucible spikes, which destroying those and trying to get rid of the large hostile crucible in the area that you are in will in general enhance things like your guardian spirits and make them stronger. But in addition to crucible spikes, we also have lesser crucibles. These are combat arenas where you'll fight a few waves of yokai of varying degrees of difficulty before destroying that crucible and typically opening access to the area beyond. Then, outside of lesser crucibles, there are the regular crucibles. You'll know you'll enter one of these because there's only a few of them, and they are the more traditional, I would say, dungeon-esque mission levels of the previous Nioh games. If anything, you might be able to call them something like a legacy dungeon almost. Basically, these are more run-of-the-mill Souls-like encounters where instead of the open world, you have a relatively linear path through the zone, while you can also hoover up all sorts of collectibles and hidden things like hot springs, etc., etc. And this is where you see more of, but certainly not all, of the types of yokai who could be friendly or hostile, like the ones pretending to be walls or the guys pretending to be chests, etc., and you have to interact with them based on the appropriate gesture so they don't kill you. Or at least try to kill you anyway. Long story short, the actual crucibles are your more traditional dungeon experiences. And putting all of that together, especially out in the open world, for the most part, I had a lot of fun exploring through here. Now, I will say in some ways, kind of strangely, having an open world actually kind of smooths out some of the progression at play here, because if you take your time and do everything in a given area, while not universally true, it is often the case I found that you would be a bit over-leveled for the rest of the content that you have to track down for the story, making some of the bosses and things that you're about to fight a bit easier as a result, especially if you've played the previous Nioh games where some of these bosses are repeats. Now, some people might not enjoy that, however, because at the end of the day, this is also a very checklisty approach to open worlds, as there are, in fact, straight-up checklists for the things like the collectibles, etc. to do. So your mileage might vary. However, I will say this is also another area where the style shift comes into play, because now we can talk a bit more about movement. So your samurai is slow, but generally better in like direct combat situations, allowing you to combo and key pulse effectively. The ninja has lower stamina cost per attack, however cannot key pulse. But they also get access to their ninjutsu and have a bunch of like medium ranged attacks, which is very helpful out in the open world, on top of ranged weaponry and using stealth to assassinate targets on top of all of that. But the real kicker here is that the ninja just straight up moves a lot faster, that is to say they run faster than your samurai approach. And so oftentimes the ninja is associated with movement and getting around, but that's hardly your only choice because as with any Souls-like, we have all sorts of various shrines which act as our fast travel points, and out in the open world you can use those freely, but in places like Crucibles, these are changed slightly to be these statues that you can only use if you are standing next to one of them, in order, of course, to make them a little more traditional, I guess you could say. Overall, though, I would say this is clearly a refinement of their approach in Rise of the Ronin, which was mostly okay. I enjoyed progression here. I enjoyed doing some quests and seeing these characters, interacting with all the different forms of yokai, and seeing their level design, which in some ways also kind of fit the open world a little more. A problem with the previous 2 games' level design is that sometimes they would have like a bajillion shortcuts in a level that made no sense because of the linear mission-based structure of them. Out in the open world, however, where those shortcuts remain permanent after you open them up the first time, they make a little bit more sense, which I got a little bit of a kick out of. I thought that was kind of funny. But all in all, I was impressed with exploration and open world-wise. I had a lot of fun running around the game's various open world hubs, even if it's not exactly the bleeding edge of innovation or anything. Now, though, for probably the largest part of this review overall in terms of importance, at the very least, and that is none other than the combats. As I mentioned, if you have played the previous Nioh games, you should feel relatively at home here, outside of a few things like the style shifting and, some of the changes to magic and some stuff like that. By and large, though, if anything, I would say combat to me feels like a combination of Nioh 1 and Nioh 2. However, they did sort of kind of nerf magic a little bit. It feels a little less impactful overall because of how you have to go about getting the spells and stuff via the soul cores, etc. The style shift is obviously a big change, but I do want to start there. The style shifts were something that I was not keen on when I first started playing this game and initially kind of learned about at large. I kind of figured you'd probably pick one style and that would be the end of it, and yet over the course of this game it's something I actually found myself using a lot. At first just for easier traversal because you're faster in ninja mode, and so it makes sense to explore in that mode where you're running around faster than very, very slowly. And yet towards the end of my first playthrough especially, I found myself actively using this in combat, in particular because it's an interesting way to get some space on occasion. So your samurai, as mentioned, can key pulse, gets generally more offensive options via things like their stances, which allows them to, of course, equip various different types of weapon combos based on the stances they're in, which should all feel familiar from the previous games, meaning that they are generally better at upfront, close, and personal combat. However, sometimes it can be very advantageous to switch over to the ninja to simply attack faster in certain situations, but if that wasn't enough, they get access to their ninjutsu, which all have a sort of like medium range to them, which can be useful for creating distance, and some of the later ones you get are especially effective. Like there's this big bomb you can chuck at enemies towards the end of it that is surprisingly devastating if you can actually fully get the animation off. There are, unsurprisingly, also certain enemies and bosses, etc. that are a little more susceptible to one type or another, and so they both have their strengths and weaknesses, and I found myself surprisingly enjoying this and using that system substantially. And the crazy part of all of that is somehow it kind of low-key encouraged me to actually key pulse the normal way instead of just doing it primarily based on the dodge action, which is how I played the previous 2 titles. I found myself properly using the key pulsing because of this differentiation between regular samurai and the ninja skills, with magic being more utility here. And while I don't think the style shifting is going to be for everyone, I did just want to point out that for some reason, it really just kind of clicked with me and it had me engage with the systems more honestly. That is to say, doing things like key pulsing the proper way, not finding ways to just necessarily cheese a boss with like sloth talisman, stuff like that, though those are still in here, though they are a slightly weaker version. But again, I get that the style shift system won't be for everybody, but it did genuinely encourage me to play more of the overall system as opposed to just sticking to the thing I liked, and that was surprising even to me. A few more things to know, however. For starters, I mentioned some stealth and ranged attacks. These are more situational. You wouldn't be doing them all the time. There are situations out in the open world where stealth is perfectly viable, or at the very least can give a massive opening move on a larger yokai before you kill them. And will also, of course, one-shot the lesser enemies as well. Ranged is much the same in the sense that if you get a headshot on unprotected enemies, it can sometimes just outright kill them, which can take away the advantage of enemies on the high ground. There's also your spirit skills and your living artifact. Now, spirit skills are a product of your guardian spirit and your progression with them. You'll have to unlock their spirit skills, but as your guardian spirit helps you out and you land successful hits, you'll build up a little meter which allows you to use that guardian spirit's spirit skills, which are effectively good at draining stamina and dealing large amounts of damage. This is one of the reasons you'll want to play around with the different guardian spirits and find the one that works for you. That's not all, however, because then we have the living artifact, seemingly a combination of the yokai shift and living weapons from the original 2 games. Living artifact allows you to transform into a very over-the-top version of either a samurai or a ninja, allowing you to attack the enemy without fear of losing health because you are immune to health damage during this. However, being attacked and taking damage eats into the duration of the form overall. You will more quickly build up spirit skills and stuff during this, and it can be a good way to sort of brute force your way through a particularly tight combo from an enemy boss or the like. It takes a little while for this particular thing to charge up, however, and that is something you can sort of build around if you want to, so certainly keep all of that in mind. Now, enemies, just like before, are divided primarily up into humans and yokai. Humans can regenerate their stamina, but are generally a bit easier to kill as a result, simply because they do not have the health pool of the larger yokai enemies. Yokai are typically more dangerous and have higher health pools, but do not restore their stamina or their ki as they take damage to it, and once it's lowered, either completely for them or humans really, you can put them into an exhausted state, allowing you to perform a grapple move, which acts as a bit of a finisher, dealing a very large amount of damage. Another thing that yokai do is occasionally drop these little dark circles called the yokai realm. Ki pulsing in those realms is how you get rid of them, though there are some sets and things that play around with just standing in those zones to deal damage, but the catch is that you regenerate very little stamina in them, and so you have to be careful. Now, this is important because each encounter is balanced thusly. Humans and yokai function differently in terms of how things like their stamina works. I would say the hardest enemies in this game are a couple of bosses that don't respect those rules. These are things like a fight with a guy called Kunimatsu, or like say the final boss as an example, who is just extremely fast more than anything, but Kunimatsu and one other boss in particular I forget the name of, do this thing where they effectively nullify the weaknesses of their particular enemy type, which makes them more difficult to kill than they would be normally, especially for somebody like myself who built around a heavy damage axe build. The way this axe build works, and it's the way I've played the previous Nioh games as well, is to basically just overwhelm the enemy defenses and cut through their stamina so fast that they're constantly exhausted and being grappled. Bosses like Kunimatsu, as an example, get around this by just regenerating stamina so very, very quickly that it is incredibly hard to grapple them. And so when you get to him, he feels like a massive difficulty spike and is kind of annoying to deal with. So while that is the case for most enemies, do understand that on occasion they like to break those rules, and unsurprisingly, I think those bosses feel the worst as a result of that. Now, as per the usual, and stuff we've seen in Nioh as well, including a lot of reuse in fact, there are set bonuses and things that you will get from various gear sets that lean into basically every playstyle imaginable, be they ninja or samurai, and seeing how they have separate gear sets, you can set them both up for success that way. But you've also got gear sets that like lean into a particular weapon damage type or a type of attack, or they might even help you out in the yokai realm, things like that. And it's really all about just finding a particular gear set that works for you and the way you want to play. Which I mention just because, remember, it's all of this stuff combined and working together that gets you to a point of being really overpowered, and I'm not even that good at it personally. I've seen the videos of people who are really good at this game. I'm simply not on that level, to be blunt about it. But defensively, you do have a few options as well. You can block, parry, dodge, burst counter, and then use that into a style shift or not. You can also burst counter with your spirit skills as well, though that is typically harder to pull off, as the timing on them tends to work a bit differently in my experience, but it's certainly a possibility at any rate. But assuming all of that isn't working and you're still having some trouble, well, I suppose that's where co-op comes in. Co-op basically comes in two forms in this particular game. You have your summoning system that works similarly to other Souls-likes in that players can use an item which drops like a little summoning shrine on the ground that you can then use a resource found in-game to summon an avatar of that character to help you. But that's just an NPC, really, and then there are expeditions where people can actually join your game and help you out and like roam around. Now, in both cases, there are bars and stuff you have to watch out for. People won't be with you endlessly, but there are some systems in place to reward these playstyles to get people to actually do it, of course. So all in all, for the combat section of this game, I would say they made some changes here. That kind of thing is never going to be universally accepted from people who may have liked the old way of doing things as an example, but speaking for myself, they made some interesting changes here that while I was hesitant on them at first, genuinely encouraged me to play more of the game via its various combat systems as opposed to just focusing on one specific thing. And while you can still drill down into the specifics of that one particular thing, I was mostly using like a certain axe combo through a good chunk of the game, as you've almost certainly seen on screen here, but roping that in with things like the switch to the ninja style and how its ninjutsu and stuff works, I, again, just felt like I had a bigger grasp of the system as a whole outside of just the one thing I enjoyed doing. And for those reasons, I really enjoyed these changes for myself at the very least. Which finally lets us move on to the Steam Deck section before we start wrapping this stuff up. Now, the Steam Deck was something I was curious about personally because the minimum specs for this game are something that the Steam Deck should be able to run. The recommended settings are a bit above it, actually. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, I would not consider this a game that I would want to play on the Steam Deck. It gets very poor FPS, even on the lowest possible settings, and so I couldn't get this to a point where I would be comfortable playing it regardless, but also as a fast-paced action game specifically. The frame rates, etc., and everything on the Steam Deck in particular just kind of made this a no-go. So I mean, in like the very literal sense that you can get the game to run, it just runs very, very poorly. And when combined again with the specific type of game this is, I just would not personally play this on the Steam Deck. I think it would need a significant amount of work to become playable there. So if you're wanting to play this on the Steam Deck currently, I just wouldn't do that. Which brings us to the positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, for me in particular, the combat itself being the biggest positive of all. I think combat is realistically the reason you are playing the Nioh games, and while we actually haven't even seen the full gear grind and the highest challenges that will almost certainly come with the future DLC, the combat here is as good as it is in the other games, and while they've changed some things, those changes, like the style shift system, are things I personally enjoyed a great deal after experiencing them in full, even if I was a little on the fence about them at first. And while it's not the most original open world system in the world, I also enjoyed the aspects of exploration and how they integrated the world. I think ironically the open world itself helped with some of their level design here. They've also got your more traditional dungeons and things. And so exploring all of that and fighting through those challenges is, I think, the best part of the game overall. But that comes with some big negatives, of course, starting with gear management. So this was already a problem in, I would say, Team Ninja's games like this, especially the previous Nioh games where you were just bombarded with loot. And while there's a couple different things you can do to try to help mitigate some of that, I think there could be more done to help organize all of this, especially across like menus and screens that just make it easier overall. And in fact, I would say if anything, separating things out into two like fully different gear sets that you have to be working on all the time, that is to say your samurai and ninja gear respectively, which is not compatible with one of the others, so they can't share a gear set or anything, has only become more complicated in Nioh 3. Rather than, say, got any better, as an example. I also didn't love the various nerfs to magic systems and how they kind of fed that fully into the soul core system. And then last but not least, a significant amount of the bosses and stuff were reused. Now, for some of that, it was to be expected. A lot of the yokai are recurring. They're very, specific types of enemies, and their moveset hasn't changed drastically or anything. And so Again, to a degree that was to be expected, but a significant chunk of the bosses and stuff have been reused from the previous games, which I would have preferred to see new and different types, and while there are a few, that's definitely another area I feel they could have done more in, which then finally brings me to my conclusion. The main point of the game, that being the combat and the gear grind and moving through all of that stuff, remains as incredibly engaging and interesting as I have found it in the previous Nioh games, and that part is incredibly well done. I think there are other parts of it that are less impressive, as is usually the case, like the story itself. The open world, while fun, is again not exactly innovative or anything, and they've also changed some systems that you don't, depending on your experience with the previous games, you may or may not enjoy as a result. Like, I really enjoyed the style shift system, but don't love what they did with the soul cores here as an example. So putting all of that together, I mostly had a fantastic time with Nioh 3 outside of a couple of annoyances here and there. For the most part, I think it's a type of game that messes around with some of its systems to advance the formula a bit, and for me, that stuff landed exceptionally well. However, I suppose when it comes to recommending it, it comes down to how much those things would bother you specifically, and to that end, there is a demo available for this game. It's a lengthy demo, in fact, that will let you experience a great deal of that stuff to help you make that decision for yourself. But for me personally, I had a great time with this. I don't love the price, and I did pay for it, to be clear. It's $70 base game, $110 for the deluxe edition, which comes with the future DLC, which is what I bought personally. And again, I don't love that price, but I do feel like I got my money's worth out of it, and for that reason, I'm going to leave it with a buy, of course, which is where we are going to wrap up this particular review. I certainly hope you enjoyed all of that. If you did, by all means, let me know how you feel about it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.